All right, diving in today, going to be looking at January 1st, 1776
Okay.
in Norfolk, Virginia.
Right.
You sent over some pretty intense historical accounts about what went down, what's known as the Burning of Norfolk.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll be going through these sources to try and
Kind of.
put together a timeline, see what forces were at play here,
Yeah, definitely.
and really kind of try and understand this pivotal moment in the early American Revolution. So
I think that one of the most important things for people to grasp in this particular deep dive is all the kind of like the complexities and the different players and their different motivations.
yeah, okay, so
Yeah.
January 1776 in Norfolk.
Yeah.
Where does this fit in, I guess, with the greater timeline of the Revolution?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that the initial sparks of the war were already flying in Massachusetts,
Right.
with the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. So this is, almost a year later
Right.
that we're talking about now.
Yeah, and Virginia wasn't just sitting on the sidelines at that point, right?
No, not at all.
I mean, there was already Patriot recruitment going on.
Oh, yeah.
Was there not?
Starting in March of 1775, the Patriot faction within the Virginia Assembly was actively raising troops.
Okay.
And this obviously created friction with the royal governor, Lord Dunmore,
Right.
about control of the colony's military resources.
Yeah. This whole gunpowder incident, can you walk us through that again?
Sure.
What happened there?
So in April 1775, on Dunmore's orders, British Marines removed gunpowder from the Colonial arsenal in Williamsburg
Right.
and transferred it to a Royal Navy vessel.
Okay.
And this action greatly alarmed colonial legislators and sparked a wave of militia mobilization.
Okay. So, they were not having that.
No.
They were not going to stand for that. But this particular incident, it didn't end in violence, though, right?
No, it fortunately did not.
Okay.
But Dunmore was definitely unsettled by the incident.
Right.
By June of 1775, he felt so insecure that he fled Williamsburg
Okay.
and took refuge with his family aboard a Royal Navy ship.
Okay.
And it's at this point that Norfolk, a major port city with a significant loyalist population,
Right.
starts to become more and more prominent
Okay.
as a small British fleet begins to assemble there.
Right. Yeah.
And, it's important to remember that this division between patriots and loyalists,
Yeah.
it was often really strongly felt
Yeah.
and varied widely from region to region.
Right. And so you've got Norfolk now, which is basically becoming like this loyalist hub
Right.
in a Virginia that's increasingly leaning towards revolution. So, you can just see how this is a point of conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before things really blew up, were there any preliminary, I don't know, clashes or?
Yeah, so there were definitely localized skirmishes and confrontations between patriots and loyalists throughout Virginia in the months leading up to October of 1775.
Okay.
It was a very, very polarized atmosphere with growing localized violence.
Right. And so around this time, Dunmore starts receiving, I guess, more substantial military support.
Right.
Beyond just the local loyalists, right?
Exactly. General Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief in North America, responded to Dunmore's pleas for assistance by sending a small detachment of the 14th Regiment of Foot to Virginia, which gave Dunmore a more formidable military force at his disposal.
And they really started targeting Patriot supply areas.
They did. Beginning around October 12th, British troops launched raids into the surrounding counties, targeting locations where they believed the Patriots were stockpiling military supplies.
Okay, and then things kind of take a sharp turn later that month with that British ship running aground near Hampton.
Yeah, that was a key incident when a small British ship ran aground near Hampton.
Yeah.
Patriot forces were able to seize it.
Okay.
The Royal Navy dispatched boats to try and retake the ship.
Right.
But they were actually repelled by Continental Army troops.
Right.
And local militia, resulting in casualties for the British.
Okay, so that was probably a pretty big hit to British prestige.
It was.
At that point in that area.
Yeah.
So Dunmore's response, it seems pretty extreme.
It was on November 7th, Dunmore issued a proclamation declaring martial law.
Wow. Okay.
Which, means civilian law suspended, military authority takes over.
Right.
Pretty serious step.
Yeah.
But even more controversial was his offer to emancipate slaves owned by patriots who were willing to join and serve with British forces.
Okay, so that's, I mean, you can see how that would have just set off alarm bells.
Oh, absolutely.
For pretty much everybody.
Yeah, both loyalist and patriot slave owners were deeply concerned.
Right.
But for different reasons, of course.
Oh, yeah.
Loyalists feared the potential for, disruption to their own property.
Right.
While patriots saw it as a direct assault on their economic and social system.
Right, yeah.
So,
so very different motivations there.
Very different motivations.
And this is what led to those really interestingly named military units, right?
Yes. Dunmore was successful in recruiting enough enslaved individuals to form what he called the Ethiopian Regiment.
Right.
And he also raised a company of loyalists known as the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment.
Right, yeah.
So these forces, along with the 2 companies from the 14th Foot, constituted the main strength of his military presence in Virginia.
Okay, so it sounds like Dunmore's feeling pretty, he's feeling pretty optimistic at this point.
Yeah, he's pretty confident. Around November 30th, 1775,
yeah,
he wrote about his belief that he could reduce this colony to a proper sense of their duty.
Okay.
So, pretty optimistic assessment there.
Right.
As history would show.
Right. But meanwhile, the Patriots, the Patriots are just standing around. What are they doing in response to all of this?
No, the Virginia Assembly had already dispatched militia to Hampton under the command of Colonel William Woodford back in October.
Okay.
And as tensions continued to rise, more and more militia companies arrived in Williamsburg.
Okay.
By early December, Woodford's force had grown to about 700 men.
Okay.
And they advanced toward Great Bridge, which is a strategically vital crossing point south of Norfolk.
Okay.
Great Bridge would actually become the site of a very, very important confrontation.
Right. I remember reading about this.
Yes.
Yeah.
So some of Dunmore's troops had fortified the north side of Great Bridge.
Yeah.
Woodford's forces set up their own entrenchments on the other side.
Right.
And their numbers continued to grow with the arrival of more militia from Virginia and even North Carolina.
Oh, okay. All right.
And then on December 9th, the British launched an attack aimed at dispersing Woodford's force.
Okay.
But they suffered a pretty decisive repulse.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's a huge victory for the Patriots at this point.
It is.
So what happens immediately following, like, what's the fallout from that?
So following their defeat, the British forces retreated back into Norfolk.
Okay.
And shortly thereafter, Dunmore made a strategic withdrawal.
Okay.
Taking his entire force.
Okay.
And most of the remaining loyalists aboard the Royal Navy ships that were anchored in Norfolk Harbor.
Gotcha. So now the Patriots have basically they've got control on land of Norfolk.
They do.
Okay.
The day after the battle, Colonel Robert Howe arrived with North Carolina regulars, further bolstering Patriot forces.
Okay.
On December 14th, Howe and Woodford, now with about 1,200 men under their command, moved into Norfolk.
Right.
And since Howe held a senior commission in the Continental Army, he took overall command.
Right. Okay. And I remember reading that Howe wasn't just focused on, like, the military part of this, right?
No, not at all.
It was something about his stance on prisoner exchanges.
Yeah. So Howe, he was a man of principle when it came to the treatment of captured British soldiers.
Right.
And he insisted on equal treatment in any exchange of prisoners. Which kind of reflected the evolving norms of warfare during that period.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So now the Patriots, I mean, they're occupying Norfolk.
Yes.
You'd think that, things would maybe, like, calm down a bit, but that's not really the case.
Not really.
Is it?
There were still concerns about the British fleet out in the harbor.
Right. They still got that threat.
Huge threat. Yeah.
They're very mobile.
Right.
They could maneuver around the town. They could potentially cut off the Patriot garrison.
Right.
So Howe and Woodford, they came to the difficult conclusion that the most prudent course of action might be to just abandon Norfolk.
Wow.
And render it unusable to the enemy.
Right. Okay.
And they formally presented this recommendation to the Virginia Assembly.
So, I mean, for our listener here, I mean, that's That's a pretty drastic recommendation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that really shows how precarious their position was, even though they're controlling the ground.
Absolutely. And then on December 20th, the Liverpool arrived, accompanied by a supply ship carrying vital provisions and munitions for Dunmore. In response, Dunmore stationed 4 of his ships, the Dunmore, the Liverpool, the Otter, and the Kingfisher, in a threatening line directly along the town's waterfront. Which, of course, prompted even more people to flee Norfolk with their belongings. Yeah, so you've got this real tense standoff now.
You do.
Were there any, like, final attempts at any kind of negotiation?
There was one brief communication on Christmas Eve. The captain of the Liverpool, Henry Ballou, sent a message into the town saying that he would prefer to purchase supplies rather than simply seize them by force. However, Hawisa rejected this and began preparations for a potential bombardment.
So right up to the new year, the tensions are just
rising and rising.
All right. So January 1st, 1776. I guess the stage is set for the burning.
It is.
So what happens on that day?
So on New Year's Day, despite the obvious tension, Hawa's guards went about their usual routine, parading along the waterfront. And then between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the 4 British ships in the harbor opened fire on the town. It was a massive bombardment, over 100 guns firing well into the evening.
Wow. I mean, that must have been absolutely terrifying for anyone who was left in the town.
Oh, absolutely.
So, I mean, what was the objective here for the British? What were they trying to do with this bombardment?
So the British deployed landing parties. With 2 main goals. Some were tasked with trying to secure provisions. And others had specific orders to set fire to buildings that Patriot marksmen had been using as firing positions against the fleet.
Gotcha. So
and were they successful in setting fires?
Yeah, despite some lack of coordination in their movements. The British landing parties did manage to set a large portion of the waterfront ablaze. And unfortunately, the wind also played a role in spreading the flames.
And so the Patriot forces, I mean, they're not just, sitting back and watching this happen.
No, the Patriot Militia. They fought back against the British landing parties. But ultimately, they couldn't control the spreading fire.
And this is where things take a kind of a more complex, controversial turn. So shortly after the British bombardment began, the Patriot forces themselves started to intentionally target properties owned by loyalists for burning and looting, including a local distillery, according to historical accounts.
So now the destruction is not, I mean, it's not just the British attack at this point. Right? The Patriots are actually involved in setting fires themselves.
Yes.
Wow.
And even after the British concluded their operations for the day, the fires kept spreading, fueled by both the bombardment and the newly ignited Patriot fires. The next morning, Colonel Howe reported that he believed the whole town will be consumed in a day or 2.
And the historical record does show that the burning and looting by the Patriots, it didn't stop there.
No, it continued for 3 full days before order was finally restored.
So I mean, I think, when people talk about the burning of Norfolk, I think the picture that they have in their mind is often a lot simpler than what...
Much more complicated.
Than what actually happened. So I guess... What was the final tally of the damage, and who do we really attribute the majority of that to?
So the figures are pretty telling. The damage inflicted by the Patriot forces actually far outweighed that caused by the British. Patriot actions resulted in the destruction of 863 buildings, estimated at a value of £120,000, which is roughly $20.4 million in modern British currency. In contrast, the British bombardment destroyed only 19 properties, valued at £3,000, in addition to the £2,000 in earlier damages caused by Dunmore's forces during their initial occupation.
So that's a huge difference.
It is.
And so how did the Patriot leadership explain explain all this?
Interestingly, Howe's initial report to the Virginia Convention didn't mention anything at all about the Patriot role in the burning.
Okay.
He just reiterated his earlier recommendation that the town should be destroyed.
Right.
A newspaper account by Lord Rawdon did raise some questions among Patriots, but initially, many just assumed that the British were responsible.
Right, okay.
For most of the damage.
But obviously, the truth did come out eventually.
It did, yeah.
About the Patriot involvement.
Yeah.
And so the Virginia Convention, I mean, they ended up approving
this
plan.
Yes.
Right, to completely destroy what was left.
Yes, to prevent the British from potentially using it.
Right, okay.
By February 6th, the remaining 416 buildings were also demolished.
Wow.
However, it wasn't until 1777 that the full extent of Patriot participation in the burning was officially acknowledged.
So they kind of...
they delayed,
Yeah, they delayed the truth coming out for quite a while there.
Yeah.
Okay, so after all this... I mean, what happened to Norfolk?
So after completing the destruction, the Patriot forces withdrew from the ruined town and redeployed to nearby areas.
Okay.
In March, General Charles Lee arrived to take command of the Continental Army's Southern Department.
Okay.
And he mobilized the militia to drive Dunmore from his encampment near Portsmouth.
Right.
Eventually, Dunmore left Virginia for good in August of 1776.
Right.
Marking the end of British authority in the colony.
Okay. And as far as, like, I guess the strategic implications for Norfolk itself?
Yeah, so although Fort Nelson and the site of the future Fort Norfolk had been fortified, they weren't enough to actually prevent the British naval bombardment.
Right.
After the war ended, the U.S. federal government purchased the fortified land and established Fort Norfolk.
Okay.
Both fortifications were then reinforced to protect against future naval assaults on the cities along the Elizabeth River. And today, there's actually a marker at the intersection of St. Paul's Boulevard and City Hall Avenue in Norfolk that commemorates this event.
Wow. So this one event, it really does kind of encapsulate a lot of the complexity.
It does.
Of this early period.
Yeah.
In the revolution, right? It's not like a black and white good versus evil.
No, not at all.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
The burning of Norfolk is often considered alongside the burning of Falmouth as an example of the kind of chaotic and often brutal realities of revolutionary conflict.
Right.
And it highlights how, local loyalties, strategic considerations, even individual actions can all come together and produce these really unforeseen and devastating consequences.
Right. So as we wrap up here, I guess what's the takeaway from this this whole exploration of the burning of Norfolk?
So I think the burning of Norfolk shows us a really complex and often overlooked episode in the American Revolution.
Right.
It shows the intertwined actions of both the British and the Patriots in the destruction of this town.
Right.
And it highlights the unstable atmosphere of the time and the very difficult and sometimes even brutal choices that had to be made.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely leaves you with a lot to think about.
It does.
And on that note, I guess a final thought for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Considering that the Patriots, they ended up inflicting the majority of the damage.
Right.
I guess, what does that tell us about, their priorities and really the nature of revolutionary conflict?
Yeah.
Was this just something that, they felt like they had to do to deny resources to the British, or does it maybe show a kind of darker side to the Patriot cause?
It's a tough question.
Yeah. This is something that I think this event really gives you a lot to think about.
It does.
The complexity of war, the motivations behind destruction.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and
thank you.
We'll see you next time.